Video, we're looking at biological explanations of schizophrenia, which includes genetics and neural correlates. Biological explanations suggest that schizophrenia is determined by physiological means. So our two explanations could both warrant a 16-mark essay, so be prepared to be able to write 6 marks of AO1 for each of these explanations. So let's start by looking at genetics. The genetic explanations of schizophrenia suggest that the disorder is transmitted and inherited through hereditary means, i.e. it is passed on to individuals from the genes that they inherit from their parents, and therefore schizophrenia runs in families. There's a really interesting book called Hidden Valley Road. It's about a family in the US who have 12 children. 6 of them have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So a really fascinating look, not just at the heartbreak of living with a family where so many people are suffering from mental illness, but it also provides insights into this whole nature versus nurture debate. So let's have a look at some evidence suggesting schizophrenia has a genetic basis. So this is Gottman's research, and it is a large-scale family study which looks at the genetic similarity of individuals and their risk of sharing schizophrenia, i.e. their concordance rates. So here we've got some coding here. So here in red we have 100% genetic similarity for identical twins. Identical twins, also known as monozygotic twins. Then we have first-degree relatives. Here in blue, these are individuals who share 50% of their genes. We have then second-degree relatives sharing 25% of their genes. That should be there, sorry. And then third-degree relatives sharing 12.5% of their genes. And this is all in comparison to the 1% of individuals in the population who suffer from schizophrenia. So what we can see here is that there is a strong relationship between genetic similarity and shared risk of schizophrenia. As genetic similarity increases, so does the probability of sharing schizophrenia. When your fraternal twin or dizygotic twin has schizophrenia, in 17% of their co-twins, they also share the disorder. When we look at pairs of identical twins, where one twin has schizophrenia, 48% of their co-twins also have schizophrenia. So as genetic similarity increases, so does the probability of sharing schizophrenia. This provides us with really strong evidence that schizophrenia is at least partially genetic. However, this is pretty crude, and we'll look at in AO3 the issues with family and twin studies, which you are all expert in already. So we can't rely on family studies to provide us with the evidence of the genetic basis of the disorder. We need to have a look at more sophisticated techniques and gene mapping. So let's have a look at some candidate genes then. So schizophrenia is polygenic, meaning many genes involved. There are many genes involved in the disorder, one of which is PCM1. It's not essential that you know that, but it has received a lot of attention recently. And schizophrenia is etiologically heterogeneous, which means one combination of genes may cause the disorder in one person, but a different combination of genes may cause the disorder in another person. So different combinations of genetic variations in different people may make them susceptible to schizophrenia. Ripke conducted a study in 2014, which was comparing the genetic makeup of 37,000 people with schizophrenia and compared their genome to 113,000 healthy controls without schizophrenia. And what he found was that there are 108 separate genetic variations associated with increased risk of the disorder, i.e. these were genetic variations that were found in patients with schizophrenia and were not common in people that were healthy, that didn't have schizophrenia. And so this suggests that there are particular genes involved. However, 108 is a lot of genes. Hence, schizophrenia is polygenic, which makes it very, very difficult for us to know the exact etiology, the exact origin of the disorder. The genes that were found in Ripke's studies are associated mostly with the neurotransmitter dopamine. And this is relevant, again, in a moment when we look at the dopamine hypothesis. So most of the genes are coding for the neurotransmitters, but interestingly, a lot of the genes also have to do with the immune system. And a lot of research now is focusing on how the immune system and immune functioning might be implicated in schizophrenia. But that's just a bit of a side note. This isn't essential knowledge, but you might be interested in sort of genetic mutations. Schizophrenia may also have a genetic origin in the absence of a family member with the disorder. So you might not necessarily have to have a parent or a grandparent who has schizophrenia to develop it yourself, and yet still your disorder would have a genetic origin. So for example, parental DNA mutations due to radiation or poison or viral infections could increase your risk of schizophrenia because you inherit that mutation, even though your family member doesn't have schizophrenia. And interestingly, there's also a positive correlation between paternal age and risk of schizophrenia. So this is because as males get older, there are more sperm mutations or mutations of DNA in the paternal sperm, and that can increase somebody's risk for schizophrenia. So for example, if your father is under 25 at conception, there's a 0.5% risk of developing schizophrenia. If the father is over 50, that risk increases to 2%. And so even that provides us evidence that schizophrenia has a genetic basis, even in the absence of family members with the disorder. So that's our genetic explanations for schizophrenia. Let's move on to look at neural correlates. We don't know exactly what causes schizophrenia on a biological level, but we have identified some neural correlates. These refer to abnormalities in the structure or function of the brain that correlate with the symptoms of schizophrenia. So there seems to be some sort of correlation between the symptoms of schizophrenia, for example, hallucinations, and altered or dysfunctional structure or function in particular areas of the brain that correlate with these symptoms. So while experiencing these symptoms, we seem to see these brain abnormalities. So this suggests that these structures or functions may be implicated in the origins of that disorder. Usually, or in the past, these neural correlates were identified through post-mortems, but now, of course, we can use more sophisticated neuroimaging techniques to compare the brains of people with schizophrenia to healthy controls. And so we can identify any abnormalities that are common in people suffering the disorder and uncommon in healthy controls. And therefore, we can identify that those abnormalities may be implicated in the origin of schizophrenia. So fMRI, for example, is a really good technique for identifying these neural correlates. And two of the neural correlates, there are many, but we're just going to be focusing on two neural correlates associated with the symptoms of schizophrenia: ventricular enlargement and the dopamine hypothesis. So let's start by looking at enlarged ventricles, or ventricular enlargement. I just want to show you a picture of a brain scan of an individual with schizophrenia compared to a healthy brain. And what you'll notice here is that there are enlarged ventricles in comparison to the healthy brain. These ventricles are fluid-filled spaces between brain areas. So this is kind of like a gap in the brain that is just filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And this is enlarged in people with schizophrenia. 80% of schizophrenics have ventricular enlargements, and this involves then a loss of brain tissue. As the ventricles enlarge and are filled with more and more fluid, then we're losing brain tissue in the surrounding areas. And that's associated with damage to central brain regions and the prefrontal cortex. And if we think about the importance of the prefrontal cortex in central control and inhibition, then we can see how this could be implicated in the disorder. Interestingly, the ventricular enlargement is evident at the first episode. And so when somebody is first diagnosed with schizophrenia and is first experiencing symptoms of psychosis, we are already starting to see ventricular enlargement, but this worsens over time. And so we get more degeneration of the brain and further enlarged ventricles as the disorder progresses, particularly in the areas of the frontal lobes. And this ventricular enlargement is most associated with the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So if we think about alogia and avolition, it makes sense when we think about the prefrontal cortex responsible for goal-directed behaviors, then we can see how damage to this area through ventricular enlargement could explain those symptoms. It's very, very interesting as well that the people that suffer from the most enlarged ventricles are also the people that are least likely to respond to medication. And so it seems like ventricular enlargement is a very severe consequence of the disorder and makes somebody more susceptible to degeneration over time. And we don't know why it happens. The mechanism that leads to this enlargement is mostly unknown. It's a very common finding. 80% of schizophrenics will suffer from enlarged ventricles, but we don't know why. So let's have a look then at the dopamine hypothesis. We've got a lot of research looking at the dopamine hypothesis, and it has been revised and revised again since the first theory came out in the 1960s. This is the original dopamine hypothesis, which suggests that in the brains of people with schizophrenia, they have abnormally high levels of dopamine. The shorthand for dopamine is DA there. So abnormally high levels of dopamine in the subcortical regions of the brain. I'll show you where this is in just a moment. So another way of phrasing this is subcortical hyperdopaminergia. So in those non-cortical, so underneath the cortex, deeper inside the middle of the brain, we have excess dopamine receptors, for example, in pathways from the subcortex to Broca's area. And this is responsible for speech production, and this could be associated with the speech poverty and some of the positive symptoms that we see with schizophrenia. So the original dopamine hypothesis says that we have high levels of dopamine in the subcortex of the brain. Later on, this theory was revised. So in the 1990s, we get our revised dopamine hypothesis. Which seems to contradict the original, but we'll look at why that's not necessarily the case. Our revised hypothesis actually says that we have abnormally low levels of dopamine, but this time in the cortex, that sort of outer shell of the brain. So our original says abnormally high levels in the subcortex, and our revised hypothesis says abnormally low levels of dopamine in the cortex, and this can be referred to as cortical hypodopaminergia. So for example, we've found more recently that in the prefrontal cortex, we have abnormally low levels of dopamine. And this, obviously, we know that this area is responsible for decision-making and goal-directed behavior, and this might explain some of those cognitive problems we'll look at in the coming weeks, and some of the other negative symptoms of the disorder. These two seem to be in contradiction, but what we're sort of seeing nowadays is that they're related and they're not necessarily in opposition. What we seem to think nowadays is that actually cortical hyperdopaminergia leads to subcortical hyperdopaminergia, which means that we can have both high and low levels of dopamine in different areas of the brain, and perhaps there is the same mechanism that is causing both of these to happen. And so, although they seem to be in conflict, that's not necessarily the case. It's really interesting how they discovered this dopamine hypothesis. It was based on the finding of how drugs work. And so we know that Parkinson's disease is associated with low dopamine levels. And what we saw is that the treatments for Parkinson's disease that increased dopamine activity put Parkinson's patients at risk of developing mild schizophrenia symptoms. And so it seemed like when we gave people drugs that increased dopamine, it increased schizophrenia-like symptoms. And for Parkinson's patients that also had a comorbid diagnosis of schizophrenia, giving them L-Dopa, drugs that increase dopamine, made their symptoms worse. So that's really interesting. And at that point, we then started to focus on dopamine as potentially one of the neurotransmitters that might be implicated in the disorder. So let's just summarize this here. I think this is a little bit easier perhaps to see. So our original dopamine hypothesis is subcortical hyperdopaminergia. So here we're looking at the regions not on the cortex. We have to sort of dissect the brain to be able to access those regions in the subcortex. But here we're looking at high levels of dopamine in the subcortex. Subcortical hyperdopaminergia. The revised hypothesis is looking at cortical hypodopaminergia. And these two don't necessarily have to be in contradiction. It seems like cortical hypodopaminergia leads to subcortical hyperdopaminergia. Really important not to get these mixed up. Make sure that you know where the high and the low levels of dopamine is happening.